We'll go ahead and get started. We're going to start off a little bit slow to talk to you all about what we got going on today. So I am Pham. I use they, them pronouns. I am with the Transgender Education Network of Texas. I'm so happy to be part of an intimate group. We can have some deeper conversation today. But I use they, them pronouns. I am a Vietnamese, Louisiana born, Texas raised kiddo. I think a huge part of what brought me here today, as I was talking here earlier, was just about the deep investment that we need to not only begin, but begin yesterday into the trans community. I think a huge part when we're talking about not only advocacy, policy, but what we do here at Tent is that we provide not only educational programs like this, part of our Trans Safe program, but we also are kind of putting the boots on the ground outside of the Capitol here in Austin, Texas. But we're a statewide org, so we also do community care events all across the state of Texas. And pretty much, I guess the best way to answer it for a lot of folks is we try to answer the question for folks that haven't been in contact with us is how are trans rights human rights, right? We answer that question at the Capitol. We answer that question not only here in Austin, but also Houston, El Paso, and Dallas. We're pretty much everywhere doing this all on the ground. But yeah, so it's so great to have you all. I'm just gonna go ahead and go over this kind of like short slide, but I just wanna have like a pretty good foundation of where we're beginning here. So just to define and where we are here, and pretty much like not only terminology, but also if we're trying to advocate for trans folks, trans bodies, and trans lives, we also need to know what trans means, right? And so transgender is just pretty much an umbrella term of someone whose gender identity does not match the gender they are assigned at birth. So you might often hear designated female at birth, designated male at birth. And a huge part of that is that how we've built up our medical system here in the US is that there's a form of in which we have to have something fit into neat, nice boxes, right? And throughout history, it never has, right? We also understand that intersex folks are around 2% of the human population, which is around the same number of redheads we have as well. But that's just the best way to kind of visualize that, is that the gender spectrum, as well as these neat boxes, don't necessarily fit gender expansive folks, right? And so gender expansive is an umbrella term that encompasses all genders but cisgender individuals, right? And so typically you'll hear like TGNC, which means trans or gender nonconforming. For some folks, for some trans folks, gender nonconforming is just but an expression as opposed to an identity. For some others, it is an identity as well. So to better encapsulate all of the trans and also gender expansive identities, we came up with TGE. And that's kind of the standard that Tent, but also a few of our state partners, as well as across the US, is trying to set this new standard to be able to encapsulate everyone, right? And so, right, I think a huge part of it is the buzzword of like around pronouns and around like identity, but also when we talk about transgender folks and also gender expansive folks, we also need to understand that when we're talking about pronouns, we're also talking about folks who have died fighting for those pronouns as well, right? And so there is a deeper meaning to that, but I also want to say that pronouns, they pretty much started along the lines of when we started globalizing business, right? In terms of like sending correspondence across the internet or across the ocean. Some folks don't necessarily assign genders to like my Vietnamese name, right? Nguyen. And so the best way to kind of interact with that is that folks would put their pronouns underneath their name in their email signature, in their correspondence. Welcome everybody, feel free and join me at the front. But yeah, so when we're talking about pronouns, like it was made for cisgender folks. It was also made for trans folks, especially when we're talking about so many different examples of what gender expansive identity and the use of pronouns, regardless of some subjects don't necessarily interact with gender. And so you might see examples of MX or many other historical versions of gender neutral pronouns or gender neutral signatures and things like that. So why are we here today? Why do
organizations like Tent exist, right? And so not only is it in media, but we're gonna talk about how transphobia is pretty much a part of most of our societies, right? And so when we're talking about hidden in plain sight, transphobia and being a trans ally is not just not misgendering folks, not just using the right pronouns, but it's also understanding that it being in part of every aspect of our society, in our media, you know, I think we also got to talk about the types of films that we only show on straight-to-TV Disney movies or, you know, right to DVD movies. But I think a huge part of it is like this trope of having a dude in a dress or a real woman. These ideas have toxicified these very, very rigid boxes that don't necessarily fit people like me who use they, them pronouns, being non-binary. I don't necessarily identify with either. However, this toxicity, it also puts into the trope of the idea that trans women, trans people are trying to trick you. What does that lead to? That leads to interpersonal violence. That leads to Texas being the bloodiest state here in Texas, right? The bloodiest state in the US for trans people, right? And a majority of them being, right, trans women of color, black trans women here in the state of Texas, right? And for about 6 years, we led the country in the most trans murders, right? We were beat out by Florida last year, but who's counting, right? So these tropes perpetuate a deep culture in which trans people frequently are killed, right, for men being attracted to them, right? More so than that, it also leads to like medical biases in our medical system. It leads to not being able to rent an apartment. It leads to not being able to receive medical care while in detention, right? These things are in every part of society. While it might not necessarily be the focal point of our society, it does have deep effects, right? And so, you know, what does an ally look like though, right? What does an ally look like is that it's more than just not making assumptions, but making assumptions has led to so much pain, not only within my own community, but also in the communities across the world, right? I think a huge part of it is that you're also not entitled to a person's medical information. And when we're talking about basic dignity, I don't necessarily ask everybody here, like, what's in your pants, what you got going on, right? Let alone, like, how everyone is in their own transition, right? When we're talking about transition, we also mean that it's a very deep personal point in our lives, and this transition is a very deep personal experience, right? I think something that we really do want to walk away with is there's not really a right way to transition. There's not really a right way to be trans or gender expansive, right? And so I think being an ally, you can also, you know, help normalize parts of our lives where we find a lot of conflict, right? Here in the state of Texas, we're an at-will state. There are no statewide protections for trans folks, either in employment, finding housing, renting, whatever that might be, right? And especially in terms of documentation, we've also found that your ID can become the barrier to you even voting here in the state of Texas, right? Being considered, oh, you don't look like your picture anymore, something along those lines, right? And so understanding that what you can do to help in these moments is also trying to support individuals, not only in your social media, but we're trying to destigmatize some of the ways of life that we have to lead through. So, for example, I love that everybody here has, I think their pronouns, right, on their badge. Perfect, beautiful, I love that, right? That's helping normalize it, right? That's helping destigmatize it, right? And I want to differentiate the two between normalizing something is just a way to bring it into the norm, while destigma is trying to remove that, right? And so you might hear sometimes a partner, like a person calling their significant other their partner, right? That in the same way has helped supported individuals that might not necessarily have what America calls a traditional relationship like structure, right? And so in the same ways, helping destigmatize that, helping normalize that, even if you're cis, is a great way to do it. Another thing is that we're here in Texas, I use y'all, right? Is not using gendered language, right? Sometimes you'll see someone walk up onto stage and say, ladies, and gentlemen, right? You can say distinguished guests, thank you for everybody for coming, but when we say y'all means all, we really do mean it, right? And so outside of that is just also, instead of assuming, you can also just ask for a person's pronouns, and those are great ways to support. And last but not least, listen, right? I think a huge part of supporting trans folks, not only in the state of Texas, but across the world, is listening to what they need, right? No one else other than themselves will understand what material needs do they need, what material wellness looks like to them, what wellness looks like in general. And so for the last 5 years since I came out, for the last 5 years since I started doing this type of advocacy, I've been asking people to listen. I've been asking folks, hey, listen to me. We need more support around HIV prevention for trans women, right? Trans women here in the state of Texas are disproportionately affected by HIV, not through, as I mentioned earlier, right? What does that no protections for employment look like in the state of Texas? That equals, right, different forms of transactional sex work, for example, not being able to find housing, things like that, right? And so those things really do affect down the line as these things do ripple out. So what can you do here at work, right? I think a lot of folks are very professional folks, is that understanding that you know some of these barriers do exist, is that it's easier to recognize what to be a good ally might look like. So there's many things that you can do in your individual role that can make it easier for folks, but a huge part of it is not necessarily putting the onus of the people doing the work only on the people that are being affected, right? Is that starting either an affinity group, an ARG, whatever that might look like, is definitely an easier way for folks to be able to voice what they need in their workplace, what they need as they like walk through the world, is that, you know, if you're a case manager, for example, you know, if you're a doctor looking for those trainings, if you are a admin of your company, requesting these types of trainings is a really good way to support it, but also raising the standard of how you can support trans folks, right, in your company, in your workplace, wherever that might be. But also, like, you know, I think a huge part of it is that, you know, we can walk out of this conversation in the next 30 minutes, but a huge part of it is some people just stop there. I'm asking if y'all could continue with your education, either that through media, there's a lot of good trans media in the last few years, but also it could just be requesting these types of trainings, right? One of the best things you can do as a trans ally is help pave that way, right? Is starting as y'all moving through that fight for inclusivity, right? And as Tent works as supporting trans folks, we also had to understand those interactions between race, class, and gender, whether that be through sexuality and how we move through the world. It also affects how well we are being productive or not. And that's not necessarily the way that an individual don't necessarily have to think about, right? In terms of if you're a cis person, you don't have to think about what does a restroom and not being able to go to the restroom that corresponds with your gender, how that might affect how well you can do at your job, right? So understanding is also a great way to build empathy as we move forward, right? So a huge thing is the takeaway from this, and I'm gonna be opening up for questions here. I know I'm keeping it short for you all, but I really wanna have a conversation with you, is that at the end of the day, the trans person isn't necessarily asking for much, right? There's not necessarily a right way to transition or the best way to accommodate us. We just simply wanna be recognized as humans, right? Which is kind of hard depending on the state that you're in. But I think that's a huge part of also that one-on-one interaction, right? And so there's definitely a myriad of ways of understanding this shared bond of humanity that we do have and deserving of the same dignity as well as the respect regardless of gender or gender identity. So I would love to talk to you all about the type of work that we do here, what building this type of trans-affirming space might look like. I understand that I was briefed that you all understand more than just pronouns, but I also want to kind of get into the nitty-gritty of what support do y'all need having a professional trans person answer your questions right quick, right? So I would love to kind of open it up if y'all have any types of questions. If not, I can ramble on about how you can. Cool. Love it, love it, love it, love it. Yeah, so I can tell you a little bit of self-disclosure about how I came out and why I moved away from HIV prevention into advocacy. Was that we have all of the data that we need to be able to see what type of investment we need into our communities, right? Especially when it comes to not only like on the ground, like one-on-one, but also when we're talking about, welcome, please. But how can we support trans folks overall, right? As I mentioned earlier, like we're talking about the lack of support in housing or a lack of support in employment and how that bleeds out. And so to better describe that is that we can better imagine how a trans person here in Austin at least, right, gets misgendered at the testing room, for example, right? The moment you walk into a testing room, you get misgendered, you clam up. After that, they ask you, what type of what is your, current sexual relationships? How's that looking in testing? And the kind of issues that come up with that is that the moment that you don't provide not even the open, warming welcome is that they clam up to not even answer the right questions, right? And that can be interactions with not only clients, but also with how you can support them down the line, right? Yes? For sure, for sure. How do you bridge the gap between like an admin who doesn't necessarily want to start creating that trans inclusive environment? Is that your question? Great, yes. So we have done trainings for a lot of different businesses here in Texas, and where we go in and we kind of have these questions of like these different barriers of understanding. And so it took me around like 6 months to even get pronouns right. And so I think a huge part of it is that understanding that's gonna take time and bringing up what types of urgency in terms of when we're talking about a trans-inclusive environment and how that can lead to not only a better enriching environment for a student, for example, right? But for a workplace, I think a huge part of like building and bridging that gap is kind of finding examples that I'm pretty sure that everyone in this room knows a trans person, whether you know it or not, right? And understanding that bringing that gap forward, but also for the employees of just simple dignity, I think that's a huge part of it. So I think you're talking about a DEI kind of inclusion, right? I think the best way to kind of like tackle that is that there are organizations as well as a lot of research that says that supporting trans folks in the workplace also supports the understanding of building a more diverse workflow in which you can interact with a lot more different clients, but also as you're, how we've been able to build large, huge leaps and bounds in supporting folks with disabilities, either in web design, bringing in, what do you call it? folks who have like color blindness, not being able to see certain colors, and like how that's been able to support a lot of different folks. In the same ways of having the understanding that gender expansive identity across the world has been here throughout history, right? And so when we're talking about gender expansive identity being on every continent except Antarctica, right? Of bringing that in as a global idea that we need to move forward past. Can you come up with another question, a more specific question?
I don't understand how somebody transitions. Like, how do you go from being one gender and now you're a different gender? And we had a huge discussion about that. And I think that's, in my company at least, the basic understanding of how that process works or how it feels for a transgender person is something that some people still can't wrap their heads around. So, yeah.
For sure, for sure. Well, I guess the best way to put it, two different branching ideas. The first idea is that folks here, like I think folks think of it as like a trend, right? So I want to kind of attack that idea of like transness being a trend. I think a huge part of it is that the work around normalizing and destigmatizing trans identity has been around for decades, right? And so as we're moving forward, we went from 1.6% of high school students identifying as trans or gender expansive to now 5% of high school students identifying as trans, right? And I think a huge part of it is that there is greater awareness around the idea, but also the velocity of ideas has increased a lot, right? And so that's one thing, is that it is not necessarily a trend, it's more so it's getting better, right? And so I think another idea is that someone explained to me their transness as if they played a PlayStation, right? They love Final Fantasy, they only played PlayStation for so long, but they look over at Xbox and they're like, oh, if I started playing Halo, I think I might be better in that way, right? And so if it was a binary transition between the two, is that for one person to finally find authenticity as well as affirmation and euphoria in their gender identity, right? As some folks might hear the difference between gender dysphoria and gender euphoria, right? Gender dysphoria is part of the DSM-5, in which a person finds great discomfort in terms of like not only like how they're perceived, but also our participation in another person's gender, right? For example, that might be using pronouns, right? And so, as a person might transition and supporting them through their transition, that affirmation and finding euphoria also supports them as a person to be happier and supported, right? And how we might accommodate one person for how their gender identity might find barriers in which not only their pronouns, but also how we can support them as just another human being. I guess I keep bouncing off this idea of like just basic respect, right? And how, for example, nicknames, right? Like I have a few nicknames. My nickname is Ginny, for example. Like folks change their names all of the time, right? In the same way that it might be just social transition. For another person, it might be looking for that affirmation to stop the pain of a person as they're identifying what their gender might be as that process goes on. And so it's also supporting that person's mental health as well, right? And so I think that's the best way to kind of go about it in terms of like bringing up that idea, is like we're also supporting them finding better processes to support their mental health as well. Are there any other questions? Yes.
We're seeing what's happening in space. What international trends are you seeing?
Sure, these international trends around the world in like trans and gender expansive identity is also like pushing folks further to the margins, right? And so here in the state of Texas, a lot of folks are quoting J.K. Rowling in the UK, right? And their processes of stopping and halting and building even more barriers for folks to receive gender affirming care, right? And so I think that's a huge part of what's happening around the world right now. I think another part of it is also like how we have seen here in Texas down to the border of Mexico, right? Folks who are trans, but also, or gender expansive, two-spirit, or like mushe, right? Which is a huge part of like their indigenous third gender or like other gender, right? Is that they have been halting care to folks in detention, right? And so that's happening here in the Central and South America, right? Brazil is also one of the bloodiest countries in the world for trans folks. And so we find that the more patriarchal society is, the more likely a trans person might find themselves in the face of violence, right? You know, we're also seeing that in Southeast Asia, where I'm from, right? A lot of trans identity is kind of being pushed as like a Western idea, and kind of this like bouncing off of like exportation or importation of ideas and culture, right? However, there's always been there. In the Pacific Island, right, there's a lot of folks who identify with third or fourth gender. In the same ways, they're also finding hard examples of where they can even find identification that might be able to encompass their identity, right? And so we're talking about identification, medical care, but also just flat discrimination and violence, right? And so those are some of the international trends that we're seeing. And we're kind of keeping an eye on that, especially with how many, the amount of migration that's happening around the world as well since the pandemic started. But yeah. So I guess the best way to talk about how to become an advocate as well, right? And so becoming an advocate, and not only in your own community, but is also understanding that we are trying to build a pretty, how do you say it? Pretty expansive referral network, right? And so as you're going back to your homes in the next 2 days, right? Looking around your communities and also understanding that there are events, there's folks and advocates pretty much in every community. Even my partner back in like New Hampshire, there's a huge like trans community there as well, right? And so they are creating events, but also support and finding where folks are doing those trainings in your state or in your city, and then bringing that in, right? Becoming an advocate also could be becoming more active, not only in your local government, but also your bigger government as well, right? In your state government. And so a lot of advocates here in Austin, live here in Austin, go to the Capitol, go to hearings, things like that. It's more than that. It's also understanding that there's mutual aid programs to be able to combat some of those barriers that folks might find for even food insecurity, right, or housing. And so building that referral network, not only in your business, but also in your lives, you can also give that down the line to the folks that might need it, right? And so becoming an advocate is also understanding and continue educating the folks around you, right? So a huge part of what we do at Tent is bringing that understanding and those questions around like, why are trans folks being included in like reproductive rights, right? Why are folks being included in immigration rights or disability justice, right? And a huge part of that is that when we say trans rights are human rights, we mean that any issue that affects a trans person is also our issue, right? And so being there for folks in every kind of aspect is also understanding to continue that education and spreading it further. But yeah, I think there's a huge part of if you do want to become an advocate and kind of talk to folks in your community, I think the best way is kind of building a framework in which that is most robust, right? Yeah. Is there any other questions I can help y'all out with?
How do you feel about like all the marketing around, like, you know, bring like all the pride branding and things like that?
For sure, I think we've definitely seen it in Florida, for example, with like the Disney Pride stuff, right? While they just passed the Don't Say Gay bill, I think a huge part of it with how we're supporting queer and trans folks is not just by making money off of them. Right? And so if we're talking about organizations in which that are receiving that money, where is that money going after? Right? Is it going to who they're lobbying with to make more money, or is it actually going back to the communities that they're trying to support? So I think a best example of what that looks like here in Austin is that our Pride Month is in August, and a huge part of it is that they bring out pretty much all of the fast tech, huge organizations to be able to put money into the city, but also bringing in the event where the parade is just giving away free advertising, right? And so when we're talking about how Pride Month has become so conglomerated and corporate, it's also thinking about how when we're pretty much getting down to the brass tacks is, are they actually going to the capital of their state and also supporting as well, right? So we're bringing in a lot of business partners to be able to testify on behalf of their trans employees, right? Is that, are they actually showing up, or are they actually actively harming it around the site as well, right? So it is a very complicated feeling, right? And when we're talking about normalizing and destigmatizing, those two things, great, right? I love it. And at the same time, you know, something that a lot of me and my organizers here in Austin is that we say that we pass around the same $20 when we're donating or supporting folks, right? Is that deep investment is also that deep investment into those communities as well. It's just not t-shirts, I would say. Very, very complicated. For sure, for sure. But yeah. Great. Any other questions, y'all? Cool. Well, happy Pride Month. I would love to invite you all. I have some brochures of our work. If you're here in Texas, I would love to invite you to become a volunteer, but we also provide like gender 101s that are a little bit more like robust than this, right? We have an hour and a half in which we go over terminology, but we also, we're building out a 102 and a 103, and y'all are kind of tasting part of that 102 and 103 right now. But I think a huge part of it is that that conversational part of like practicing situations, as well as how to even write a testimony when you go to the Capitol might be an example, right? But yeah, thank y'all so much for coming out today, and I would love if y'all we can like talk a little bit after too. Great. Thank you.